recently that I've been a pastor for pretty much half of my life. This coming June will be starting my, I would have been a pastor for 26 years. And there's really one question across that time as I've been at various places and have done pastoral work, and that is, in one form or another, people ask this, what does God want me to do with my life? Or how can I know God's will for my life? Now, that's an interesting question. Those of us who are in ministry talk about God's calling us into ministry. But I believe that all baptized Christians are called into ministry. I think that's really, not that I just think that, that's actually been the teaching of the church for about 2,000 years, but that baptism calls all of us to go into ministry in one kind or another, whether that's, and some people are called beyond that to do that professionally, but all Christians are called to be in ministry. But how do we know what God's call is? That's kind of a thing, when you hear that God's call, it's kind of hard to describe. How can we find God's plan for our life? Now, when I was going through the process to be ordained, and, in the United Methodist Church, we get that name because we're methodical. That's where that comes from. That was actually a put down when John and Charles Wesley started their little holy club, is what they called it, at Oxford University. People made fun of them and called them, well, you're just a bunch of Methodists. So we're methodical about everything. So there's a process, and there's a process for going through, for people going through feeling that they're called to be ordained and what that means to be ordained. And one of the things I had to do in that was I had to take a test that determines, or at least helps to determine, whether I'm really called and has a sense of God's calling me into ministry. Now, according to the results, when I got those back, my mentor through that process met with me, and he said, "You're almost too sure." He said, "You go off the scale of how sure you are that you're called to go into ministry." He said, "You might want to back off on that a little bit, just in case." He said, "But what this shows us is that even if in this process you get turned down by the United Methodist Church," he said, "you're going to be in ministry somewhere, because that's what that shows." Now, when you hear that about God's call, I never heard a big booming voice out of nowhere. I didn't hear the heavens didn't open up before me and thunder and lightning come down and this big voice calling me to do that. That didn't happen. But I did get a real deep sense, somewhere in the deepest part of me, that God was calling me into ministry, and then specifically to be a pastor, and then specifically in the United Methodist Church. That's hard to explain. It's hard to really describe what that is like. You know it when it happens, but to describe it to somebody else is really hard to do. It's kind of like Louis Armstrong was asked one time, what is jazz? And his response was, "Man, if you've got to ask, you'll never know." So it's kind of like that. But I still, even though I went off the scale as far as surety of call, even though that's what I've been doing for the last 26 years, I still struggle and wrestle with what it is God's calling me to do. Because specifically, obviously, there's the call to pastoral ministry, but God calls people in different ways in different places in their lives throughout their life. It's not just like it's a static thing, like here you are, and it's all a done deal. I still have to listen all the time to God's voice. And the best advice I ever heard about that, in terms of trying to decide if there especially is a decision between one thing and another thing about what God is calling us to do, and this is helpful to anybody when you're getting a sense of what does God want me to do for my life, it says, if you're facing a choice between two roads, look for the one on whichever the shadow of the cross falls. And that's the road to take. Now, the cross is everywhere in our culture. It's often worn in churches by pastors and by others who preach and teach. It's worn as a symbol. I've got several of them on right now. We have it up on the altar. We have it in our symbol with the cross and the flame. It's also on the necks of people who kind of glam it up and turn it into bling. They use it as jewelry. Whether they're Christian or not, it's become kind of a popular symbol to use. Everything from sexy movie stars and violent rappers can wear a cross. And they really don't see a conflict sometimes between the symbol of the cross and how their words and actions, whether that backs up what the cross symbolizes. It's just jewelry. In fact, there's a new trend now, you might have seen that, of wearing a sideways cross necklace, where the cross is laying on its side, which has been said to symbolize everything from laying down or picking up the cross to being a sign that Christianity has failed and has fallen. So the cross is everywhere. It's become part of the background. It's just something we see all the time, and a lot of people, again, don't really even know what it means. But that wasn't always the case. In the Roman world of the first century, in which the church was born, and in which Jesus lived, and in which the apostles all lived, wearing a cross around your neck, nobody would have done that. It would have been like we're promoting the electric chair. You're wearing a symbol of imperial power and of death and of torture. The Romans used to set up crosses with crucified people on them along the main roads everywhere that they were going in to conquer people, to show what happened if you stepped out of line of obeying the empire. The cross was scandalous. If you were carrying a cross, you were a dangerous criminal who deserved to die. Because crucifixion was reserved for only the worst of the insurrectionists and terrorists and other criminals that were hung on crosses. It was only the worst people, the worst kind of criminals, that would be executed in that way. And nobody in polite society would even mention the symbol of the cross because it promoted fear. If you wanted to, in the first century world, flip somebody off, you didn't use a particular finger. I won't do that. But if you want, you didn't use that. This is how you flip people off in the first century. You made the sign of the cross. That was a sign of cursing somebody. You're saying that you wanted them to die in the worst way possible. That's where that symbol originally came from. But when the early Christians used the cross as the primary symbol of their worship and their faith, that was a scandalous thing. To turn a symbol of a curse into a symbol of blessing. It was a chance for the Roman world to mock them because they thought it was ridiculous. Nobody would ever use the cross as a sign of hope and a sign of love. There's still today, you can go to Rome and see an early graffiti drawn on the wall of the Palatine in Rome that shows a slave falling down in front of a crucified donkey. And the inscription underneath says, Alexamenos worships his God. That's what they thought of Christianity. They put a donkey on a cross. In the ancient world, the cross was a sign of helplessness, of passivity, of victimhood, and people did everything that they could to avoid having anything to do with the cross. But the early Christians took that symbol of the cross as a sign of the active triumph of their God over the power of sin and death, and it caused a major revision in how that sign was seen. So what does the cross mean to us? St. Paul writes to the Corinthians, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." When Christians look at or even wear a cross, it's a sign that shows we're a part of God's kingdom, that is opposed to the kingdoms of this world. It's a sign that others won't understand because it looks ridiculous. But God made foolish the wisdom of this world. What was considered weak and useless and a sign of death and a sign of imperial power is now the sign that saves those who believe. That ancient sign of death becomes a symbol of life. And the cross of Jesus was a scandal in the ancient world. The Jews couldn't imagine The Jews of the first century, because people think this whole idea that resurrection was just a story that came about at that day, and people just commonly thought about that, but nobody thought about resurrection in the way that it happened. The Jews couldn't imagine a Messiah who would die. That was not in their worldview at all. They never could possibly understand that the Messiah was going to die, let alone be crucified in the worst way possible. And they, at least some of them, believed that God was going to resurrect all of his people at the end of time. But they couldn't believe that God was going to resurrect one person in the middle of history. They never would have expected it. That's why people didn't understand. That's why the apostles and others didn't understand when Jesus started saying, I got to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die, and on the third day I'm going to rise again. They didn't understand that. That wasn't in their worldview. And for the pagans, on the other hand, salvation was all about health and wealth in this life. They had no concept of a life after death. So the best that could happen in this life was you lived a long life and were prosperous in this world. That's the best you could hope for, which is why many Roman tombstones have an inscription on them that says, non fui, non sum, non cura. I was not, I was, I am not, I care not. And Paul says to the church at Corinth, for Jews demand signs, and Greeks desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block. That's literally a scandal for Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. The Jews were confronted with the horrifying idea of a crucified Messiah, while the Gentiles were given a sign that there is resurrection after death, that there is something that goes beyond this life, that eventually, just as Jesus was bodily raised from the dead, that we will be bodily raised from the dead. The sign of the cross challenged their definitions of health and prosperity and hope and pointed to a different sort of life and a future than they could ever possibly have imagined. And Paul invites his readers to listen in and lean into this new reality. He says, but to those who were called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. That's a radical message. And the cross is not just a fashion accessory. It's not just a way to decorate our churches. It's a sign that we are part of an entirely new world. Bishop William Willimon and Stanley Hauerwas, who both at one time taught at Duke University, wrote a book called Resident Aliens, Life in the Christian Colony. And they say this about the cross. The cross is not a sign of the church's quiet, suffering submission to the powers that be, but rather the church's revolutionary participation in the victory of Christ over these powers. The cross is not a symbol for general human suffering and oppression. Rather, the cross is a sign of what happens when one takes God's account of reality more seriously than Caesar's. The cross stands as God's and our eternal no to the power of death, as well as God's eternal yes to humanity. God's remarkable determination not to leave us to our own devices. The powerful sign of the cross has to be activated within the people for whom it is giving life. The best sign of the cross is found in the life and actions of those who are in a process of being saved by the power of God. Paul says just after the passage we read, consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Christians should not be recognized by the usual signs of success in this world, but by the sign and work of Jesus Christ within us. And the church is a countercultural community, standing over against empire and over against the blending of church and state. It's in Christ that we find true wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. And we demonstrate and show the world Christ's best not by the jewelry we wear or the fish signs that we stick on our bumper stickers, but by living lives that are scandalously humble and generous and loving. And that is radical. If you remember a few years ago in Pennsylvania when a man walked into an Amish school and told all the boys to get out, and we rounded up all the girls that were in that schoolroom and shot every one of them, and then shot himself. Do you remember what the Amish community did after that? The families of those girls went to the home, because they knew who this guy was. They went to the home of where the shooter had lived to meet with his wife and with his family, and to show their support of her, and to say, we're praying for you because we know you lost a loved one today. That's radical. That's what it means to take the road on which the shadow of the cross falls. Not to take the easy way, not to take the way that's going to bring us the most comfort or the most success in the eyes of the world, but to take the way that will show the scandalous love of Jesus. We recognize that the cross has offered salvation for us individually. But too much of American Christianity is all about individually. It's all about us and Jesus. Me and Jesus, rather. But when we recognize that, we need to live as a cross-shaped community. Paul's letter to the Corinthians was designed to address divisions in the church. I know that is shocking to think that there were ever divisions in the church, and that people actually argued about stuff. And when that happens, inevitably it does, but when it does happen, how those divisions are handled is important, because those divisions can block the sign of the cross to the world. But instead, we are to be united in the same mind and the same purpose. The early church thrived in the Roman world because it continued to live the life of the cross despite ridicule and mockery and persecution. The Roman government couldn't stop it, where they would march entire families out and kill the entire families, or when they would take them out on the frozen lakes and have them freeze to death. They said they went to their death singing hymns to their God. In a world that's becoming more and more divisive, in places where people are more concerned about arguing than they are about coming to any kind of understanding, even within the church, there's so much division. The sign of the cross has to once again become the sign that reminds us it's not about us. It's about what God has done for us in Christ. The cross is the sign that allows us to drop our pretensions that we have individual strength and we have to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and invites us to become part of a community where strength is found in weakness. So how do you know what road God is calling you to take? How do you know where God is directing you in your life? Look for the road on which the shadow of the cross falls.